You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, I thought this was an especially important episode to record. You have been sounding the alarm on the blueprint that the Supreme Court just handed to Donald Trump in the event that he wins the November election and takes office. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, and this is not hyperbole, nor is it a stretch. In fact, this is exactly what Justice Sotomayor pointed out in her dissent. And here it is, Brian. The Supreme Court just delivered a blueprint to any president, but I think our greatest concern is how Donald Trump will then use this blueprint to the danger and disadvantage of democracy. Here's what he gets to do. They said there are certain core presidential powers, and a president is absolutely immune when he acts in furtherance of one of his core presidential powers. They gave two examples of what those are. One, the power to pardon people, and two, the power to consult with his attorney general and high DOJ officials and tell them what to do, of course, in the name of fighting crime. So what they said was that when a president exercises any of his authority in these core presidential power arenas, he can't be questioned about it. Nobody can look behind it. We can't investigate it, and it doesn't matter what his motive was in exercising these powers. So what that means is, in the context of the pardon power, Donald Trump could set up a pardon kiosk in the lobby of the White House, have people lined up who had been convicted of crimes, and sell pardons for $1 million or $1 billion a pop. And the Supreme Court said, as Justice Sotomayor emphasized, nothing could be done about it. Law enforcement, prosecutors, and courts could do nothing about it because it's a core presidential power. That's literally what the Supreme Court said a president can do. Let's shift to the other and related, as we talk through it, core presidential power to consult with your attorney general and tell him what to do, because you're fighting crime after all. So Donald Trump could tell his newly installed attorney general, if he could find somebody more corrupt than Bill Barr, he would probably choose that person. Of course, I'm sure Bill Barr would do Donald Trump's criminal bidding again in a new administration, the way he did in the last Trump administration. All he has to say to his attorney general is, I am ordering you to round up and detain in detention camps all of my perceived enemies, my rivals, my political opponents, all of them, anybody who has criticized me over the past several years. And I'm ordering you to do it without charges being brought, without any evidence supporting charging or detaining them, and without any due process of law. The Supreme Court said that's a core presidential power, and it can't be investigated or prosecuted. You can't even ask the president's motive behind doing it. Now, some people might say, yeah, but the attorney general, the people following the president's orders to do this unlawful thing that the president has immunity for, they could be charged, couldn't they? Yes, they could, because the attorney general does not enjoy presidential immunity. So what Donald Trump then does is takes advantage of his other core presidential power, the pardon power, and he pardons his attorney general. So there would be no redress for what I just described in accordance with the powers that the Supreme Court just gave a president. If that isn't sufficiently dire, indeed, I think the way Justice Sotomayor ended her dissent is with fear for our democracy. I dissent. And that is what Donald Trump, if he retakes the reins of federal power, will be allowed to do based on what this Supreme Court just said.
Glenn, I know that the question that's at the top of everybody's mind right now is what pushback is there when the Supreme Court itself, the highest court in the land, passes down this edict where there's no higher court than them that is nakedly unconstitutional on its face, like this one is?
There is no constitutional solution to this problem, because there are times in our nation's history when we have come close and maybe even experienced what's called a constitutional crisis. The last time we were close was when the Trump administration wanted to put a citizen question on the census, and the Supreme Court ruled, you can't. It's unconstitutional. How did the Trump administration respond? Donald Trump said, yeah, I might do it anyway. Now, he ultimately was talked out of it by calmer heads, and he relented. But if he had done it, that would have been a true constitutional crisis, because now you have two branches of government, the judiciary and the executive branch, that are at odds, and there's nobody to break the tie or come in and say who ultimately wins. It's just one branch of government disobeying another with no remedy. So your question is a great one. What do we do about a Supreme Court that just acted contrary to the Constitution, which is precisely what they did? You know, this is not atextual. In other words, in the absence of the Constitution saying anything about presidential immunity, maybe you can make it up. This is anti-textual. This contradicts two provisions in the Constitution that clearly signal that a president can be prosecuted for his crimes. So I'm going to answer your question with a question, because unfortunately I don't have a solution, but we're going to be searching for one in the coming days, weeks, and months, because this Supreme Court opinion cannot stand, as many legal experts have gone on record as saying, you know, this is like Dred Scott, right? Or this is like Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. Those things couldn't stand either, and they didn't. It took a long time for them to fall, but they didn't stand, and this won't stand either. So here's the question I would use to answer your question. What can we do? I spent 6.5 years on active duty in the Army, and I was very proud to serve. And in the Army, we are taught two things. One, you must obey a lawful order. But two, and more importantly, you must disobey an unlawful order. So the question becomes, when the Supreme Court issues an unlawful, unconstitutional opinion, how does the citizenry, how do the other branches of government, the executive and the legislative, respond? Because you can't just go quietly and slouch toward totalitarianism because the Supreme Court and Donald Trump have set up that potential end result. So we're going to have to talk a lot more about precisely what we do to combat an unconstitutional, lawless power that was just granted to the president by the Supreme Court.
And, you know, I think the most telling part is that we actually could see this coming in terms of the extent to which the Supreme Court has opted to just kind of relinquish their duty in terms of interpreting the Constitution as it's written. I mean, this is me as like a liberal complaining about the Supreme Court justices in a 6-3 conservative court not being textualists. You look at something like Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, where the plain text of the Constitution prohibits somebody from running again for office if they were found to have engaged in insurrection. That is exactly what Donald Trump did. It doesn't get clearer than that. There is no ambiguity there. It was adjudicated. It was found by Judge Wallace in California. It was found by a trial court judge in Colorado, the Colorado Supreme Court. So this issue was put to rest, and yet they opted to defer to Donald Trump in defiance of the plain text of the Constitution. And then now, in this instance, they turned around and created out of whole cloth provisions of the Constitution that do not exist in blind deference to Donald Trump, knowing full well, by the way, that even though Joe Biden is presumably imbued with these powers now, that he'll never exercise them because he actually cares about the Constitution as it's written, not this perverted version of the Constitution that was created by these Supreme Court justices in deference to Donald Trump.
And Brian, let me add one more to the mix, because you're exactly right that they ignored the exact, express, clear, unambiguous language of the 14th Amendment, that an insurrectionist, after taking an oath to support the Constitution of the United States, is disqualified, is ineligible to hold office, state or federal, moving forward. That's the plain language. They disregarded it. They went against it even after Donald Trump was an adjudicated insurrectionist. The other thing they did literally in recent days, they saw that Donald Trump was charged with the crime of obstructing an official congressional proceeding. The exact language of the statute says if you obstruct an official congressional proceeding, you can be prosecuted. And they said, you know what? We don't even think that's what Congress meant when they used those express words, those clear words, those unambiguous words. So instead of running the risk that Donald Trump would be prosecuted for that crime, because he's indicted for that crime in D.C., they invalidated that statute. That is another plain example of them ignoring words, exact words, express unambiguous words, to do Donald Trump a big favor though.
Which is to say nothing, by the way, of that little nugget that Clarence Thomas threw in, apropos of nothing, where in this immunity ruling, he wrote that he questioned the constitutionality of special counsels unto themselves, knowing full well that the question of dismissal in the Florida case, pending right now before Judge Cannon, is whether Jack Smith even had grounds to bring this case because he's a special counsel.
Yeah, and that was Clarence Thomas doing something that as far back as 1911, the Supreme Court said it would never do, issue what's called an advisory opinion. That was not an issue in the case. It wasn't argued. It wasn't briefed. The Supreme Court didn't direct the parties to take up that issue. So all Justice Thomas did was send a signal to Judge Cannon and a lifeline to Donald Trump that, hey, come on, Eileen, just go ahead and throw that case out altogether because I got your back if that issue gets before me.
Tell you what, with judges like these, who even needs defense attorneys? We'll stay on top of this because it is more important now than ever to continue shining some sunlight onto this stuff. So for those watching right now, if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe to both of our channels. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.